They gave me a white coat the day I arrived at Auschwitz, not as a gift, not as a symbol of healing, but as a tool, like a shovel or a rifle, a weapon of survival disguised as mercy. I was 26 years old, a physician by training, a Jew by birth, and a ghost by necessity. My name is Miriam Vogel, and this is the story I buried for 50 years, not because I was ashamed of surviving, but because I was ashamed of how I survived. I came from Warsaw on a transport in January 1943. The cattle car held 98 women. By the time we reached the ramp at Birkenau, only 83 were still breathing. The rest had suffocated, frozen, or simply given up in the dark. I remember the door sliding open, not with a crash, but with a slow, metallic groan, and the cold hitting us like a physical blow. Snow fell in silence, no birds, no wind, just the barking of dogs and the sharp commands of SS guards in black uniforms that seemed to absorb the light. We were ordered to undress, to surrender our hair, our clothes, our names. They shaved us, tattooed numbers on our forearms, and handed us striped rags that barely covered our bodies. I stood in line, shivering, clutching the only thing I hadn't lost, my mind. And in that mind, I repeated my training like a prayer: diagnosis, triage, care. Even here, I told myself, knowledge has value. Then an officer noticed my hands, not soft, years of hospital work had hardened them, but clean, precise, used to holding instruments, not rags. He asked if I was a doctor. I hesitated. To say yes was to risk being used. To say no was to vanish into the crowd, likely to the right. I chose truth. I am, I said. He nodded and pulled me from the line. That night, I was taken not to a barracks, but to a small room near the infirmary, a place with a cot, a basin, and a white coat hanging on a hook. It smelled of antiseptic and mildew. A prisoner functionary, a Polish woman named Halina, handed it to me. "Wear it," she whispered. "It means you live today, maybe tomorrow." She didn't say what it cost, but I would learn soon enough. The next morning, I stood on the ramp for the first time as staff, not as a victim, but as a participant. Dr. Mengele was there, immaculate in his uniform, gloves pristine, eyes bright with clinical curiosity. Beside him, I felt like a shadow. My job was simple: assist in selection, point left for labor, point right for processing. I wasn't to speak. I wasn't to react. I was to observe skin tone, gait, posture, and decide who might last a week in the factories, who would die in an hour. The first transport I saw was from Theresienstadt. Elderly Jews, artists, scholars, families who'd been told they were going to a spa town. They stepped off the train, dazed, carrying suitcases with towels and toothbrushes. An old man with a violin case clutched his granddaughter's hand. She couldn't have been more than 7. Mengele glanced at them and flicked his finger to the right. I said nothing. I couldn't. But as they passed me, the girl looked up and said, "Are the showers warm?" I nodded. My throat closed like a fist. That night, I vomited until there was nothing left. Halina brought me water. "You think you're the first," she said bitterly. "Last month, they made a dentist pull gold teeth from the mouths of the living. He hanged himself with his own stethoscope." She lit a stolen cigarette. "Your choice isn't whether to be clean. It's whether to be useful enough to stay alive long enough to bear witness." I didn't understand then, but I would. In the weeks that followed, I learned the language of survival. A cough meant death, a limp meant death, pregnancy, always death. I began to see people not as souls, but as symptoms, and with each selection, a piece of my humanity flaked away, like paint from a wall in the rain. But the worst moment came 3 weeks in. A woman stepped off the train, thin, exhausted, but standing tall. She looked at me and her eyes widened. "Miriam," she whispered. It was Leah, my neighbor from Warsaw. Her husband had been my patient, her son I'd delivered. She reached for me. Mengele watched, waiting. I couldn't save her. If I showed recognition, we'd both go to the right. So I looked through her as if she were glass. I pointed left, knowing her fever would kill her in days. She didn't cry. She just nodded, as if she understood the price of my silence. That night, I wrote her name in a scrap of paper, ID hidden in my shoe. Leah R., Warsaw, mother of Jakub. It was the first name on what would become a secret ledger of the lost. They gave me a white coat to make me useful, but it made me complicit. And for 50 years, I couldn't look at white without seeing smoke. Because in Auschwitz, even mercy had a price, and I paid it with every soul I failed to save. After Leah, I began to write names, not in a notebook, that would have been suicide, but on scraps, the back of a ration wrapper, the margin of a discarded SS form, the inside of my shoe lining. I wrote them in pencil, faint enough to erase if searched, but clear enough to remember. Leah R., Warsaw. David K. Lodz, violinist. Rivka M., pregnant 5 months. Each name was a stone I placed in the hollow of my chest. A weight to keep me from floating away into numbness. The SS called it record keeping. They needed lists for labor assignments, for death tallies, for the cold arithmetic of extermination. But my lists were different. They weren't about function. They were about memory. Because in Auschwitz, to be forgotten was to die twice, once in the gas chamber, once in history. And I refused to let them vanish that completely. My duties expanded. I was no longer just on the ramp. I worked in the infirmary, a grim parody of a hospital, with straw pallets instead of beds and boiled rags instead of bandages. The sick came to me not for healing but for judgment. A fever, 2 days rest, then back to labor, or the chimney. A broken finger. If you could still grip a shovel, you lived. If not, you were processed. I learned to speak in code. Rest meant hope. Special care meant death. And I delivered both with the same calm voice, the same steady hands. But the true horror wasn't in the decisions. It was in the repetition. Day after day, the same script. Train arrives, doors open, chaos, silence, selection. The faces changed, but the pattern never did. And with each cycle, my soul grew quieter, like a radio losing signal. Then came the transports from the Netherlands. Well-dressed families, children with toys, women with pearls still around their necks. They'd been told they were being resettled. One woman, elegant even in rags, handed me a photograph as she passed. "For my daughter," she whispered. "If you see her, tell her I loved her until the end." I tucked it into my coat. Her name was Elise van Dijk. She went to the right. I never saw her daughter. I kept the photo for weeks, hidden in the lining of my coat. At night, I'd take it out and stare at the smiling face of a little girl in a garden. I imagined her growing up in hiding, waiting for a mother who would never return. And I wondered, was it kindness to carry that photo, or cruelty to hold on to a hope I knew was false? Alina found me one evening, tears streaking the grime on my face. "Stop," she said sharply. "You'll break if you keep feeling like this." "How can I not?" I whispered. "Because feeling gets you killed," she replied. "Here you don't feel. You endure. You remember later if you live." She was right. So I built walls. I stopped looking into eyes. I stopped hearing names. I became a machine, observe, point, record. But at night, alone on my cot, the walls crumbled. The faces returned. The hands reached for me. And I would whisper their names like a prayer I wasn't sure God could hear. The worst was when children came. Not infants, those were almost always sent directly to the right. But older ones, 10 or 12, who might pass for laborers if they stood tall and lied about their age. I saw boys puff out their chests, girls bind their chests with rags, all to look stronger, older, worthier of breath. And sometimes I let them through. Not because they were strong, but because they were children. And for that small act of rebellion, I carried extra guilt, because for every child I saved, another adult took their place in the line to the showers. One day, a boy of 11 stood before me, trembling but defiant. "I'm 14, he said in perfect German. His eyes begged me to believe him. I looked at his hands, small, soft, unused to work, and knew he was lying. But I pointed left. Mengele glanced at me, amused, but said nothing. That night I learned his name, Jakub L. from Krakow. He lasted 3 weeks in the quarry before pneumonia took him. I wrote his name twice. The lists grew. I hid them in the sole of my shoe, sewn into my hem, tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the infirmary. They were my secret rebellion, not with guns or sabotage, but with remembrance. Because if I could carry their names out of this place, then maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't be erased. But the cost was my peace. I stopped dreaming of Warsaw. I stopped dreaming of medicine. I dreamed only of the ramp, endless trains, endless faces, endless choices. And in those dreams, I always pointed wrong. In the spring of 1944, the transports grew larger. Hungarian Jews by the tens of thousands. The crematoria worked day and night. The air smelled of burning hair and wet ash. And the selections became faster, more brutal. Mengele barely looked up from his clipboard. He'd wave entire cars to the right with a flick of his wrist. And I stood beside him, silent, complicit, writing names in my head when I had no paper. One afternoon, a woman broke from the line and ran toward me. Guards tackled her before she reached me, but not before she screamed, "Tell them we were here. Tell them we didn't go quietly." They beat her unconscious. I never learned her name, but I added her to my list anyway. Unknown, Hungary, brave. Helena was taken in July. Typhus, or so they said. I suspect she'd hidden extra bread for a child and was discovered. The day she vanished, I felt the last thread of my humanity fray. She'd been my anchor, my warning, my mirror. Without her, I was truly alone. I kept writing. Not because I believed I'd survive, but because if I died, I wanted someone, anyone, to find those scraps and know these people lived. They loved. They mattered. The white coat I wore was no longer a symbol of healing. It was a shroud I wore for the living, and every name I wrote was a stone in the grave of my innocence, because in Auschwitz, even memory was an act of defiance, and I defied them with every name I refused to forget. In Auschwitz, words were dangerous. A whisper could mean death. A name spoken aloud could vanish you into the night. But touch was something else. Not safe, never safe, but possible. And so, I learned to speak with my hands. It began by accident. A woman stumbled as she walked toward the showers. I reached out to steady her. She looked at me, really looked, and in that glance, something passed between us. Not hope, not comfort, but recognition. You see me. I'm not alone. She squeezed my hand once, then let go. I never saw her again, but I remembered the weight of her fingers, the dryness of her palm, the quiet dignity in her grip. After that, I did it again. And again. Not to everyone. Mengele watched, and too much compassion drew suspicion, but to those who seemed to be dissolving into the fog of despair. The elderly who shuffled like ghosts. The mothers clutching children they knew they'd lose. The young men whose eyes had already gone hollow. I would brush a hand against theirs as they passed. A light touch on the arm. A brief clasp of fingers. Nothing that could be called defiance. Just a human gesture in a place designed to erase humanity. They called me the nurse who holds hands in the barracks. Some thought I was mad. Others called me a saint. I was neither. I was a woman drowning in guilt, and those small acts of contact were the only lifelines I could throw. Not to them, but to myself. Because in that touch I proved I was still human. That I hadn't fully become what they wanted me to be, a machine of selection, a cog in the engine of death. But touch had consequences. One day, a girl of 16, barely more than a child, was sent to the right. As she passed me, she whispered, "Will it hurt?" My throat closed. I couldn't lie. So I took her hand and held it as we walked the last 100 meters to the fake showers. I didn't speak. I just held on, as if my grip could shield her from what waited inside. The SS guard watched, but said nothing. Perhaps he was tired. Perhaps he too needed to believe someone still cared. Afterward, I scrubbed my hands until they bled. Not because I was ashamed of comforting her, but because I was ashamed that I could walk away while she could not. That my white coat granted me the privilege of grief while she was denied even a proper burial. The hands became my secret language. A squeeze meant I see you. A pat on the shoulder meant you are not forgotten. A lingering touch on a child's head meant someone will remember your name. I never knew if they understood, but I needed to believe they did. Then came the winter of 1944. The transport slowed, but the cold deepened. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, lives. In the infirmary, I wrapped frozen limbs in rags, knowing it was futile, but doing it anyway. One night, a young man with blackened feet whispered, "Don't let them take my shoes." My mother made them. I promised I wouldn't. When he died at dawn, I hid the shoes under my cot. They were small, worn, lined with cloth. I kept them for months, until the soles rotted away. Then I buried them in the snow behind the latrine. A tiny grave for a life no one would mourn. Helena had warned me, feeling gets you killed, but I discovered something worse. Not feeling kills your soul long before your body dies. So I chose to feel, to risk the pain, to carry the weight of every hand I held, every name I failed to save, every silence I kept. The SS noticed. Not enough to punish me, but enough to watch. Once an officer pulled me aside. "You're too soft," he said, not unkindly. "This isn't a hospital. It's a factory. Workers break. You replace them." I nodded. But that night, I held the hand of an old man with pneumonia as he coughed his last breath. His name was Samuel. He'd been a tailor in Prague. He died whispering, "Tell my wife. The blue coat fits." I never found his wife. But I wrote his name. And I remembered the blue coat. By early 1945, the camp began to unravel. The Allies were coming. The SS grew nervous. Transport stopped. Then came the death marches. They emptied the barracks, forcing the weak to walk west in the snow. I was kept behind, too valuable as a medic, they said. But I knew the truth. They were saving me to kill me last. In those final weeks, the infirmary filled with the dying, those too sick to march, too broken to move. I moved among them like a ghost, offering water, adjusting blankets, holding hands. No more selections, no more lists, just presence. And in that presence, I found a strange kind of peace. Not forgiveness, never that. But purpose. One woman, feverish and fading, grasped my hand and said, "Sing to me." I didn't know any lullabies, so I hummed a melody from my childhood, a Yiddish folk song my mother used to sing. She closed her eyes and smiled. She died an hour later. I kept humming long after. When the Soviets arrived in January 1945, I was sitting beside a boy of 9 who hadn't spoken in weeks. He clung to my hand as the gates opened, as soldiers in strange uniforms shouted in a language I didn't understand. He didn't cry. He just held on, as if my hand were the only thing tethering him to the world. They took us to a field hospital, gave us soup, clean clothes, asked for names. I gave mine. But when they asked what I'd done in Auschwitz, I said only, I was a nurse. I didn't tell them about the selections, the lists, the hands. The shoes, the songs. That truth was too heavy for strangers. So I buried it again, deeper this time, beneath layers of survival, resettlement, silence. For 50 years, I never spoke of the hands. Not to my husband, a quiet man who'd lost his entire family in Treblinka. Not to my daughter, born in a refugee camp in 1946, whose first word was Mama. I became a pediatrician in Toronto. I healed children. I held their hands when they were scared, and every time I did, I thought of the hands I'd held in Auschwitz, not to heal, but to say goodbye. People assume that to survive such a place, you must harden your heart. But I learned the opposite. To survive, you must keep your heart soft enough to feel the weight of what you've lost, and strong enough to carry it. I held their hands, not because I could save them, but because someone had to bear witness to their humanity. And in that act, I saved a piece of my own because in the end, the only thing the Nazis could not take was the choice to be human, even for a single fleeting touch. Liberation didn't feel like freedom. It felt like falling. One moment, I was holding the hand of a boy who hadn't spoken in weeks. The next, I was standing in a field hospital in Krakow, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of soap, real soap, and weeping for reasons I couldn't name. The Soviets called us survivors, but I didn't feel like one. I felt like a ghost, who'd wandered out of the wrong grave. They gave us food, but I couldn't eat. They gave us beds, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the ramp, the trains, the smoke, the hands reaching for mine. I stopped speaking for weeks, not out of trauma alone, but out of guilt. What right did I have to speak when so many voices had been silenced forever? So I stayed quiet, and in that silence, I buried the truth deeper than ever. In the summer of 1945, I was transferred to a displaced persons camp near Munich. It was a place of waiting for news, for visas, for a world that might want us again. I worked in the camp infirmary, not because I wanted to, but because it was the only thing I knew how to do. Children came to me with fevers, scrapes, nightmares. I treated them gently. I held their hands, and every time I did, I saw the faces of the children I'd failed to save. It was there I met David. He was a teacher from Łódź, thin as a wire, with eyes that had seen too much but still held kindness. He didn't ask about my past. He simply sat with me in the evenings, sharing bread, watching the sunset, letting silence be enough. One night he said, "You carry something heavy. You don't have to carry it alone." I didn't answer, but I let him take my hand, and for the first time since Warsaw, I didn't feel like a monster. We married in 1946 in a small ceremony under a borrowed chuppah. There were no parents, no siblings, no childhood friends, just other survivors, all of us stitching new lives from scraps of the old. David never pressed me to talk. He understood that some wounds don't heal, they just scar over, quiet but present. And I loved him for that silence. Our daughter Rachel was born in a refugee hospital in Stuttgart in 1948. When they placed her in my arms, pink, squalling, alive, I sobbed uncontrollably. Not just from joy, but from terror. How could I be a mother when I'd once decided who deserved to live? What if I failed her the way I'd failed them? But she looked at me with eyes so clear, so trusting, and in that gaze I made a promise. I would never let her know the darkness I carried. I would give her light, even if it meant living in shadow myself. We moved to Toronto in 1951, sponsored by a Jewish community group. I became a pediatrician, not by choice, but by necessity. Medicine was the only profession that recognized my foreign degree. I opened a small practice in a quiet neighborhood. Mothers brought their children to me for ear infections, broken arms, childhood fears. I listened, I soothed, I held small hands. And no one knew that those same hands had once pointed to the gas chambers. I never wore white again. Not in the clinic, not at home. I wore beige, grey, soft blues, colors that didn't remind me of the coat I'd worn in Auschwitz. At Rachel's school plays, I sat in the back, clapping quietly, always careful not to draw attention. I baked challah on Fridays, planted tulips in spring, attended parent-teacher conferences. I built a life so ordinary it felt like armor, but the past never left. It lived in the small things. The sound of a train whistle in the distance would freeze me mid-step. A child's cough too deep would send me into a spiral of dread. Once a patient's mother thanked me for being so gentle with her son. I smiled, but inside I screamed, "You have no idea what my hands have done." Rachel grew up thinking I was just shy, quiet, a little distant. She didn't know that every bedtime story I read, every lullaby I sang, was an act of atonement. That every time I kissed her forehead, I was apologizing to all the children I couldn't save. David knew something was buried, but he never dug. "Some doors are better left closed," he once said. And I believed him until the day he died in 1982. As he lay in his hospital bed, weak from cancer, he took my hand and whispered, "Whatever you carry, Miriam, it doesn't define you. You've spent your life giving others what you thought you stole from them. That's not guilt, that's grace." I didn't understand then. But I would. After he died, the silence grew louder. Rachel urged me to join a survivors group, but I refused. I wasn't like them, I told myself. They had suffered. I had collaborated. Never mind that I'd been forced. Never mind that I'd saved who I could. In my mind, I was still the woman who pointed to the right. Then, in 1994, everything changed. Rachel was cleaning the attic when she found my old medical bag, the one I'd brought from Europe. never opened in 50 years. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were my lists, hundreds of names, written on scraps of paper, faded but legible. Leah R., Warsaw. Jakub L., Kraków. Elise van Dijk, Amsterdam. She brought them to me, her eyes wide with sorrow and awe. Mama, she said, why didn't you ever tell me? I broke then, not with sobs, but with words, decades of them spilling out like water from a cracked dam. I told her everything, the selections, the hands, the shoes, the songs, the unbearable weight of choosing who lived and who died. She listened without judgment. When I finished, she took my hands, the same hands that had held the dying, and said, you didn't choose who died. The Nazis did. You just tried to keep some alive long enough to be remembered. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe her. But the truth was still mine to carry. And I knew I couldn't take it to the grave, so I began to speak, not publicly, not yet, but to historians, to teachers, to anyone who would listen. I gave my lists to Yad Vashem. I recorded my testimony for the Shoah Foundation. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I asked only that the names be remembered, because survival wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a different kind of duty, to bear witness, to honor the lost, and to ensure that no one ever forgets that even in hell, someone held their hand. I'm 92 years old now, and my hands tremble so much I can barely hold a teacup. But they still remember. They remember the weight of a child's fingers as she walked toward the showers. They remember the dry palm of an old man whispering his wife's name. They remember the rough wool of a prisoner's sleeve, the smooth wood of a hidden shoe, the paper-thin skin of the dying. My body is failing, but my memory is sharp, too sharp. And for the first time in 50 years, I'm grateful for that clarity. Because now, at the end, I finally understand. I was not meant to forget. I was meant to remember for them. After Rachel found the lists in 1994, something shifted inside me. Not forgiveness, that is not mine to claim, but purpose. I began to speak, not in grand halls or on television, but in classrooms, in community centers, in the quiet corners of libraries where students came to learn about a history that must never repeat. I told them about the ramp, the selections, the impossible choices. But I also told them about the hands, the songs, the shoes buried in the snow, because if they only remember the horror, they'll look away. But if they remember the humanity, even in the darkest place, they might choose differently when their own moment comes. A young teacher once asked me, "How do you live with what you did?" I corrected her gently. "I didn't do it. It was done to me. And to them," she nodded, but I could see she didn't fully understand. How could she? She'd never stood on a ramp with the power of life and death in her trembling hands. So I told her about Leah from Warsaw, about Jakub the violinist, about the woman who handed me a photograph and said, "Tell my daughter I loved her." "Those are the names I carry," I said, "not as a burden, but as a covenant." In 1998, I traveled to Auschwitz for the first time since liberation, not as a prisoner, but as a witness. The barracks were preserved. The tracks still led to the ruins of the gas chambers. The air was quiet, no dogs, no shouts, just the wind moving through the poplars. I walked to the infirmary where I'd worked, now a museum. In a glass case, they displayed a white coat like mine. I touched the glass and wept, not for myself, but for all the hands that never got to hold theirs. Rachel came with me. She held my arm as we stood before the memorial wall, where thousands of names are carved in stone. I found none of mine, Leah, Jakub, Elise, but I whispered them anyway. "They're here," I told her. "Not in stone, but in memory." And that's enough. Back in Toronto, I began writing. Not just names, but stories. I described the blue coat Samuel's wife made, the Yiddish lullaby I hummed to the dying woman, the way the snow fell the day Helena vanished. I wrote for Rachel, for her children, for anyone who would listen. Because memory is not passive. It is an act of love. And love, even when it comes too late, is never wasted. People often ask if I believe in God after what I saw. I tell them I don't know, but I believe in hands. In the way one human touch can say, "You matter," when the world screams the opposite. I believe in lists, not as records of death, but as testaments to life. And I believe that even in a place designed to erase identity, someone chose to remember. My daughter published my writings in 2003 under a simple title, The Hands That Remembered. It's not a bestseller. It's not meant to be, but teachers use it. Students read it, and sometimes a letter arrives. Your story helped me understand my grandfather's silence, or I named my daughter Leah. Those letters are my absolution, not from God, not from history, but from the future. I no longer dream of the ramp. When I sleep, I see faces, but they are smiling. Leah holds her grandson's hand. Jakub plays his violin in a sunlit square. Elise's daughter tends a garden, just like the one in the photograph. In my dreams, they are not lost. They are living, and I am with them, not as their judge, but as their witness. Last year, Rachel brought her granddaughter Maya to visit. She's 7 years old, the same age as the girl who asked me if the showers were warm. Maya sat on my lap and asked, "Bubby, were you brave in the war?" I held her small hands in mine, soft, warm, alive, and said, "I was scared. But I tried to be kind." She nodded solemnly. Kind is braver. In that moment, I understood everything. My life after Auschwitz wasn't about atonement. It was about planting seeds of kindness in soil that had been scorched by hate. Every child I healed, every hand I held, every name I whispered, those were my resistance. Not with weapons, but with tenderness. And it was enough. I will die soon. My body tells me so, but I am not afraid, because I have done what I was meant to do. I carried their names out of the darkness. I gave them back their humanity, one memory at a time, and in doing so I reclaimed my own. So let this be my final testimony. In the face of evil that seeks to dehumanize, the most radical act is to touch, to remember, to say a name aloud. I held their hands as they walked to the showers, because no one else would, but I hold their names now so that no one ever forgets. They were here. They were loved. They mattered. And that, after all this time, is enough. Someone held their hand.